Welcome back to On the Clock, presented by Capital One. I'm your new host, Alisa Gumbs. On this show, we spend a little bit of time with a wide variety of people exploring how we're getting through these extraordinary times day by day. For the next few episodes, we're going to talk about one of the most used words of the past year, equity. Of course, for those of us from communities that haven't traditionally had equity, it's way more than a buzzword. And here at Black Enterprise, where we've been pushing for equal access and opportunities for Black America for the past 50 years, the concept of equity is not new. But it is more relevant than ever, as both the government and corporate America have had an unprecedented focus on helping diverse communities overcome racial disparities. Our first guest is someone who oversees community development and relations and corporate philanthropy for one of the country's largest financial institutions. Please welcome the Executive Vice President and Head of External Affairs at Capital One, Andy Navarrete.
Morning, Alisa, and honored to be part of this conversation. So thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for being here. Andy, last year, Capital One announced the Impact Initiative, a multi-million-dollar commitment to advance socioeconomic mobility. And the plan is to do that in a few ways: by advocating for an inclusive society, by building thriving communities, and by creating financial tools that enrich lives. Tell us about the initiative.
Sure. And, it comes from an understanding that banks play a very, very unique role in our society. We're one of the few industries that is actually legally required to give back to communities through the Community Reinvestment Act. And I think for some institutions, that's more of a sidelight, right? Something that is not core to their business or core to their strategy. But Capital One has a pretty unique story in banking, having started by serving the Main Street communities, the full spectrum of borrowers, regardless of circumstance. And I think that origin story, in many respects, contributes to our viewing our place in society and a role in the economy a little bit differently. And so when we were thinking about defining more precisely the kinds of activities we wanted to support in our communities, socioeconomic mobility felt like the right answer, something that was inextricably linked to our strategy of often being somebody's first experience with credit, but then growing with our customers over time in a way that allows them to build wealth, that allows them to achieve the proverbial American dream. And so with the Capital One Impact Initiative, we committed $200 million over the next 5 years to support those broad areas that you just articulated. But drilling down a little bit, our focal points include affordable housing, workforce development, small business incubation, and financial well-being. And as you can imagine, these are initiatives that while they serve the community, also very much serve our business interests. And so it's a little bit of what I would call enlightened altruism of trying to bring better integration to what we're doing in the community and what we're doing strategically.
What does it mean for Capital One to have a commitment to social impact and economic impact?
Well, as I said, we succeed when our customers succeed. And we have a broad interest in reaching the full range of consumers and businesses across America. And so for Capital One as a bank, where we do lending, where we take deposits, where we support large commercial enterprises, small businesses, individual consumers through credit cards or auto loans, we have obviously a big role to play in the lives of those we serve. And so, for us, that sort of unique platform has us, believing that we can be an engine for progress and an engine for social change. We often say that, in looking at the circumstances of the last 18 months, while COVID certainly impacted everyone in some way, shape, or form, the truth is it impacted communities of color particularly harshly. And these weren't new issues. These weren't new challenges that these communities were facing. COVID just laid bare what we already knew to be true. And so, from our perspective, if we can make a difference in these communities, if we can step in very tangible ways and contribute to their economic well-being, we believe that we can be then a force for increasing equity, across every dimension.
I mentioned in your intro that you oversee corporate philanthropy. What do you see is the correlation between philanthropy and equity?
I think it's really starting from a place of understanding that the playing field is not level. I think there is a perception that whether it's government policy or whether it's court cases or a variety of different means that we've used over the centuries to affect change, that somehow we have achieved answers in a space where it's clear that equities continue to persist. And so when one looks at the structural roots of inequity, the systemic racism that in many respects continues to pervade our society and continues to serve as a headwind, I think, to economic progress, you realize that solving for the social is the same as solving for the economic and vice versa. These aren't mutually exclusive goals. In many respects, our systems and the institutions that we have in place aren't necessarily serving the needs of communities of color. And so one has to first acknowledge and recognize that, and then set about, what is the best way then to serve the economic interests of these communities. And so in our minds, it's one conversation, not two conversations operating in parallel.
You just mentioned that although we've been working on this for a long time, we really haven't, answered the problems. But how have you seen philanthropy positively affect communities of color?
In our case, we've been adamant, and my team here, we say this all the time, that we're not going to operate as the Department of Philanthropy or the Department of Good Works. We don't want to be a silo, within a 52,000 person organization like Capital One. We want to make sure that what we are doing in the philanthropic space is fully integrated into what we are doing as a business. And so that sort of underlying philosophy, I think, allows us to look at our philanthropic activities as also being part and parcel of our business interests. And so when we talk about workforce development, we don't only look to build skills among those who may benefit from retraining and be able to pursue career track kinds of positions. We want to hire those individuals in the end. When we support small businesses and try to incubate small businesses, particularly in communities of color, we are looking for our suppliers of the future. And so, these are, areas where when we find the right partners and find the right organizations in the local community that are really doing extraordinary work, we feel that our job is not only to support that work, but to amplify it and ultimately to be an end user of the services that they provide. And in that way, we think we achieve a considerably greater impact than just, mere dollars would allow us to do.
When we talk about creating a more equitable society, we each have a role to play. What role do corporations like Capital One specifically play in that?
Well, I alluded earlier to the fact that, for quite some time, I think most people in this country were looking to government and those kinds of public institutions to really solve society's problems. I don't think I'm revealing anything by suggesting that our government right now isn't working as effectively as it may have in the past, and certainly isn't aligned in a way that I think allows the legislative realm to necessarily solve the country's biggest problems. By the way, I know we're going to hear from a councilman later, and I think wonderful things are going on at the local level and sometimes at the state level. But in terms of federal policy, I think this is an area where the private sector has had to step in and to serve a very different role. There are those who bemoan corporations getting quote unquote political. But in our minds, we are institutions too, and we serve these broader communities and have to be engines for change, engines for progress. And so in our minds, stepping into the realm of trying to solve for issues like racial equity and socioeconomic mobility are very much part of our mission. We serve a broad range of stakeholders. And so in our case, if we can do our part to make the country a better one and to create more opportunities for everyone, at every point in their lives and in their journeys, then we feel like we should step up and do that.
Finding solutions to inequity is not a job for just one person or one corporation. And we have people out there working hard to improve disparities in all aspects of Black life, especially economically. So we want to bring a couple of other voices into this conversation. First, we have the executive director of the Black Economic Alliance, a coalition of business leaders committed to economic progress in the Black community. Please welcome David Clooney.
Thank you for having me. Good to be with you.
Thank you for being here. We also have an esteemed member of the City Council of Washington, D.C., who's working on the legislative side to increase investments in Black communities, and that's Council Member Kenyon McDuffie. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you.
So for all of you, we're doing a 4-part series that's focused on equity, which I think is often a misunderstood concept. What exactly do we mean when we say equity, and how is that different from the focus we've had over the past few years on diversity and inclusion?
So I'm happy to start there. When I think of equity, it is an acknowledgement that people are starting from different places, and it's an acknowledgement of the particular circumstances each person is dealing with. So you're trying to solve for that by meeting people where they are and putting in place systems and programs to essentially reach everybody and put them on an equal footing. Equality, diversity, and inclusion. So diversity is more about representation in my mind and making sure that different types of people and perspectives and backgrounds are represented in decision-making and staff and even in programming and allocation of resources. And inclusion is making sure that you have an environment and culture that includes all those people. But equity, I appreciate that we've been talking about it in a different way in this past year. And I think that is the key to making sure that the resources and initiatives actually reach the intended recipients.
Yeah, if I could just dovetail on what David said, you hit the nail on the head. I think frequently people confuse equity for equality and think it's a notion that you give everybody the same thing and expect them to succeed. And the reality is some people need more than others. And so the short answer is equity means giving people what they need to be successful. It is, like David said, and this is the phrase I've been using, particularly during the pandemic, meeting people what they are to give them what they need. And in the District of Columbia, I think what I've said to people is we all will have achieved equity once residents across the city can no longer predict their success by their zip code. Equity is very different from diversity and inclusion, which is certainly good and necessary, but they don't necessarily address the real problem here. If you look across indicators for success in the nation's capital, like wealth and income and employment, housing, health, education, criminal justice, the one factor that really weaves itself through all those stark inequalities that exist between Blacks and whites in the city is race. And so we got to acknowledge, I think, frequently the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that's a lot of these things didn't occur by happenstance. They took years, decades, centuries, in fact, to develop. And it's a result of things like slavery, Jim Crow segregation, government-sanctioned discrimination, and policies like redlining that resulted in the stark racial wealth gap that exists in the District of Columbia and in cities across the country.
So never in recent memory have we had more of a focus on racial equity with what's been going on in the country over the last year between the racial justice movement, between the COVID pandemic. What progress do you guys think has been made over the past year? And in what ways do we need to evolve from where we are right now for the movement to continue?
I'll jump in. I certainly think there's been some progress made. And frankly, I think it begins with acknowledgement that that Black people often are on the bottom of this notion of American dream. We are not achieving it. We have the gaps that exist in those indicators I just mentioned. And you can't do the same thing for everybody and expect certain groups of people to succeed. And you've got to be intentional. You've got to be deliberate in your policymaking. And for someone like me on the Council of the District of Columbia, it means you have to call out race and point out the things that have kept people from achieving wealth in society. And I think it's sort of partnerships in the private sector that exist with people like Capital One and other banks where you're seeing the types of investments that I think need to be made to really create the sort of economic opportunities and security in communities of color. And be just more intentional about it. So I think that is progress, that you're hearing people talk more about this, that you're seeing investments made in communities. And it's not spreading money around equally. It is saying this is a place where, for example, in the District of Columbia, the median net worth of white families is 81 times higher than the median net worth of Black families, 284,000 to 3,500. And you've got to be smart and intentional about how you address that and begin to chip away at the inequities that exist.
I absolutely agree with that. And I'll just add two things. One, I think to Councilmember McDuffie's point, one of the pieces of progress or one of the signs of progress for me is that we as a society are seeking a better understanding of how we got to where we are. So when we think about financial institutions and other participants in a market, they are thinking about how did we get here? So I think about an example around housing. Housing has been the largest avenue to the middle class for white Americans and builder of wealth for Americans over generations outside of the Black community. And you think about after the Great Depression, during the New Deal, the Fair Housing Act and the Federal Housing Administration, their underwriting guidelines included guidelines saying you cannot lend in Black communities, and essentially cut out Black people over 30 years. 98% of the federally backed affordable mortgages were given to white families and built wealth that has generational impact. So when you have financial institutions like Capital One and others thinking about, well, how can we make a difference? Understanding that history is part and parcel to equity and actually going directly to the problem and being able to counteract it and reach people where they are. And then the other piece of it is I think progress I've seen is, previously we talked about diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial equity as something that was, somebody else's job. People would see it as, well, I work in X industry, so, I work in tech, so that's not really my thing. I think people better understand that racial equity is something that we all interact with every day. And people and organizations, importantly, are using their platforms in a much more thoughtful and direct way to kind of peel back the onion and say, how do we interact with racial equity? What are the inequities that we've seen in our own work environment, in our own work we do with our customers, our communities, and how can we be part of the solution in proactively counteracting that?
Andy, what kind of progress have you seen over the last year, whether it's from the corporate side or from your impact?
Alisa, I want to pick up on something David said, because I think it's really, really important. That in many respects, I think the dialogue has improved because our understanding of the issues has improved. If one is going to understand where we're going, you need to understand where we are and where we've been. And the greater focus on historical context and the policies that in many respects have served as significant headwinds to progress, a better understanding of data, as Councilmember McDuffie indicated about the continuing chasm in the wealth gap between the Black community and other communities. These are the kinds of data points, the kinds of facts, and the kind of analytics I think we need to bring to this discussion across all segments if we're going to land on, I think, the right answer. So what I've seen in terms of progress is, in many respects, the private sector, as I kind of alluded to in our opening comments, really stepping in and understanding it needs to help fill these gaps. It can't wait for the public sector to solve all of these issues. And so whether that's raising the minimum wage, whether that's supporting workforce development programs with an eye towards hiring these individuals, whether it's supporting small businesses with an eye towards creating your supply chain of the future. These are the ways that I think we have moved in the private sector away from this notion of pure philanthropy for philanthropy's sake, and much more towards targeted philanthropy that is actually advancing the economic interests of the communities we're looking to serve.
David, one of the biggest misconceptions out there historically, and I'm hoping that this is starting to change, is that this is a Black problem. As someone who's specifically focused on economic progress, I think you're in a great position to tell us how the lack of access and opportunity for Black entrepreneurs affects the larger economy.
It absolutely does, and I appreciate the question. This is another place where I think we've seen progress in the past year, where there is a better understanding about how the condition of the Black community and Black economy is inextricably linked to the condition of the US economy writ large. And we've seen a lot of studies and reports. So this is really one of the things that the Black Economic Alliance was formed to address, which was having Black business leaders speak to the importance of economic mobility for Black folks as a necessary component of any effective, sustainable economic growth strategy for the entire US economy. And some of the statistics and data that have borne that out and help illustrate that are things like a McKinsey report from 2019 that show if you were to close the Black-white wealth gap, you could add between 4 to 6% growth to US real GDP by 2028. And Citi put out a report last fall showing that the US economy has lost out on $16 trillion, that's with a T, $800 billion of activity and growth over the last 20 years as a direct result of racial inequality, and that we could add $5 trillion to GDP if we were to close that wealth gap. So I think there's a better understanding about how the structural inequity and just cracks in the Black economy have continued to act as a drag on the entire US economy for our country's entire history. Well, that's not true. It in fact is one of the reasons why the United States is so wealthy, is because we were built off of the back of free labor. But after the end of slavery, I think the unequal and kind of unequal access that Black Americans have had for our entire history in this country after slavery continues to act as a drag on the economy. And I think there's much wider interest now in fixing that structural damage as a way to improve the entire US economy writ large.
You mentioned that this is exactly why the Black Economic Alliance was formed. And in a year when there is so much focus on Black business, where I actually saw, Black business trending as a topic on Google for the first time ever. And it feels like we're finally having the ears of people who are in the position to move the needle. How has the Black Economic Alliance positioned itself now for, to have the greatest impact?
So great question. We really sit at the intersection of the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, and there's a better sense of engagement and understanding now about how there's a need for an all hands on deck approach if we're going to have systemic improvement of the opportunities and conditions for Black folks to have an avenue to wealth building, and what that means for the rest of the economy in terms of growth, and especially now after the pandemic, or coming hopefully on the other side of the pandemic as we rebuild economies, thinking about how we can do it in a more sustainable way. So the Black Economic Alliance has been, unabashedly using our networks, resources, relationships with senior leadership and everybody in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, and getting them to do things like commit to. We stood up a program at Morehouse and Spelman colleges, for example, called the Center for Black Entrepreneurship, where we are essentially creating an ecosystem of opportunity, investment, and exposure for Black entrepreneurs that we just haven't had before. We know before 2020, for example, only 1% of venture capital finance, less than 1%, I should say, of venture capital finance went to Black founders and Black entrepreneurs. And even in 2020, after the influx of investment in our community, still only about 3% of venture capital finance went to Black entrepreneurs. So we're trying to remove a lot of those barriers and create systems and even relationships and just pipelines for opportunity by using the access that we have as business leaders and as folks who have inroads in politics, to make sure that we are getting better information to the places needed, but also opening access and creating relationships that will have a commercial benefit for everybody.
Councilmember McDuffie, you mentioned the racial wealth gap earlier. David just gave us, some statistics that really illustrate, what we're dealing with when we talk about that gap. A lot of your racial equity work is focused on closing the wealth gap. Why is it so critical that we address that specifically?
Well, I think it's a great question. And I think if someone doesn't have access to wealth, even a small amount, it means for them and their family that they're significantly less likely to be able to buy a home, which is one of the ways that most people in the United States build wealth. And they won't be able to start a business, retire with financial security, or even absorb the economic shock of events like losing a job or paying for some unexpected medical expense. And so the racial wealth gap that I talked about earlier, it exists here in the district, and it really drives many of the other inequities that we see in economics and housing and health and so on. And so you can't solve all these issues individually or in a silo with some piecemeal approach. And I think policymakers need to really be bolder to be able to address the root cause, which is really, we've touched on it a bit, but it's really centuries of systemic economic disenfranchisement that was intentional. And so I think you need the same intentional economic policies that are designed to really build wealth and to chip away at the racial wealth gap that exists, because it won't disappear on its own.
Well, speaking of bolder solutions, you've been getting a lot of press lately for one of your ideas, and that is baby bonds. Can you tell us about it and what it is intended to do?
Sure. Yeah. So the baby bonds bill, and formally I refer to it as the Child Wealth Building Act. But if it was enacted in the district, this bill would really provide the district government-sponsored trust funds for babies born in the district into households whose incomes don't exceed 500% of the federal poverty line, which currently translates to about $132,000 or so for a family of four. We would make the enrollment automatic, right? So you don't have to come knocking on the doors of government. This would be an automatic enrollment, and each eligible child will receive an initial deposit of about $1,000, followed by annual deposits of up to $2,000, depending on the household income. And once a child turns 18, they'd be able to withdraw the funds for purposes that include things like education, business ownership, investing in businesses, buying a property, retirement investments, and all these vehicles that would enable low to moderate income residents to accumulate wealth and break the cycle of generational poverty in which a lot of them live today. And so I think it's incredibly important. I think it's a bold idea. I think it will be, if passed, one of the most significant measures in council history that is designed to chip away at that racial wealth gap that we've been talking about.
Critical to achieving equity as a society is how we support our local communities. And you are working on the local level every day. What are some of the prevailing issues that you and your team are currently working to address outside of wealth?
Outside of wealth, which is really one of the major issues that we're working on, because it really touches on so many other opportunities. But there are other issues too. Any city, USA, and in the District of Columbia, I'm doing a number of other things, including working around issues of criminal justice and public safety, trying to create healthier communities. I introduced a bill called the Neighborhood Engagement Achieves Results Act. We refer to it as the NEAR Act. And it passed the council unanimously a few years ago. And at its core, it takes a public health approach to crime prevention and intervention by connecting individuals at high risk of being victims of crimes or perpetrating violent crimes, particularly gun violence. It connects them with mental health resources, supports and services. In some cases, if they're ready, it puts them in a classroom to learn, get the soft skills that they need to be employable. It connects them to subsidized employment. And it remains one of the most comprehensive public safety and police reform bills passed anywhere in the country. And so, we want to keep putting the resource behind these types of efforts to really create healthier communities, because I think healthier communities are safe communities, and safe communities are places where businesses want to invest, where entrepreneurs want to open up a brick and mortar restaurant, where they're going to be hiring people who perhaps have the jobs and the skills that are on the lower end. And we really need that. We need these communities to support one another. And I think looking at healthy communities as a way to do that is critically important. And so I'm looking at economics, I'm looking at healthy communities, and we're going to keep putting our efforts behind these big, bold ideas to really transform people who are stuck in generational poverty in the District of Columbia.
Andy, we know that Capital One has a long-term interest in advancing economic and social opportunities in the communities where you operate. What types of equity work can we expect to see from Capital One this year?
I want to pick up on something that the council member was talking about, which is this notion that as we now can finally, see the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel coming out of the pandemic, we have an opportunity to stay focused on addressing equity as a continuing gap, even in the post-COVID era, and making sure that this is an inclusive recovery. And so as we think about the different places where organizations like Capital One can invest, we recognize that we can't go back and solve for some of the intergenerational wealth gaps that existed, with the inequitable opportunities under the GI Bill, for example, coming out of World War II, that sort of set in motion massive wealth accumulation in the white community, but for communities of color, they were often held back. But there's this concept in banking around compound interest and the power of, starting, to save for retirement early and watching that grow over time. It's never too late to start these investments. And so in many respects, what we want to focus on is ensuring that we are investing in small businesses through partnerships like the Black Economic Alliance, an innovative local organization run by Melissa Bradley called 1863 Ventures, where you're looking to support entrepreneurs in communities of color in a way that I think they have been denied opportunities in the past. We are very focused on making sure that progress in our cities like DC doesn't shut out the communities that built those cities over time. And so we're focused on affordable housing, but with an eye towards avoiding some of the downsides of gentrification, where longstanding communities are then dislocated. And we're looking at financial well-being programs, partnering with organizations to help close the digital divide, which is again something that I think the COVID pandemic has really revealed to be a significant impediment to so many communities of color taking advantage of work opportunities, of financial service opportunities, and of business opportunities. So that's just a small sampling, but something where we hope we can continue to work with our partners in the public sector and with organizations like the Black Economic Alliance to really make a difference.
For all of our guests today, as we wrap up this discussion, our audience is predominantly corporate professionals and entrepreneurs. What advice would you give to those people out there who want to continue this drumbeat for change? What can they do?
Happy to start.
Sorry, go ahead, David.
Oh, you got it. Go ahead.
Thanks. Well, one place I would start is really make this part of your corporate mission. As a private sector company, this can't be an off the side of the desk activity. As David noted in his commentary, this is a huge market and a huge business opportunity that is in many respects largely untapped. And so see your contributions to the community as an opportunity to also advance your strategic goals. And what I think that means in practicality is that this can't be a handful of people off, in some corner of the enterprise trying to make a difference. It really needs to be harnessing the energies and the skills and the talents of your entire associate or employee base to really try to bring analytics and data and rigor to the problem solving. And I think if we can do that, we can harness that energy, we can make a real difference.
So perhaps I should have jumped in front of you, Andy, because I was going to say something very similar. But I'll add to that. Great points. And I'll add to that. I think we'd love for organizations to think about how you interact with racial inequality and going at it directly. But Andy's point is a great one, that there are more than enough examples now, and I am very confident after the just influx of investment in this space that we've seen in the past year and that we'll see going forward, you'll see more examples of companies doing well by doing good. and essentially making it a part of their core mission to address racial inequality in a way that impacts their corporate environment, their employee environment, the culture that they set as a company, but also the way that they interact with their market and their communities. And I think that companies thinking directly about how do we interact with it, and you don't have to go completely out of your ethos, but making this a part of your ethos and thinking about how you can have the mutual benefit of improving conditions for your own employees, your own stakeholders, and the communities you serve by the way that you do business, and then seeing a commercial benefit because of it is an absolutely win-win situation.
Yeah, both great thoughts, and let me add to it. My biggest request, I think, would be for people and companies to make meaningful investments in these communities, particularly communities of color, where they're largely Black people, Latinx people. And this doesn't mean that you give money and you check the box. You know, these communities and the people and small businesses in them need sustainable investments and real economic opportunities. So plant a flag and think about every single aspect of the economic development pipeline and figure out how to connect those people in those communities to it. Figure out how to connect those entrepreneurs of color to those different aspects of the economic development pipeline. In the district, less than 14% of businesses are Black owned. And Black owned businesses make up only 9.5% of DC's sales revenue. So even though Black residents make up almost half of the city's population, you know, that's the cost when we don't, you know, intentionally create equitable policies, and we aren't being intentional about finding Black owned small businesses and entrepreneurs and connecting them to the opportunities. And so I'd also say that representation and leadership positions matter. I recently introduced a bill requiring more leadership positions in DC's public utility companies and boards. You know, we want them to be diverse. We want them to be representative of people who understand these communities, and we want those folks to be in decision-making positions. And so while I think inclusion and diversity are incredibly important, they aren't a panacea. As we discussed earlier, it does help steer companies and communities and governments in a more thoughtful and inclusive direction, which I think is absolutely essential to keeping us moving forward. So I think it's been a great conversation. I appreciate you all having me be a part of it.
Well, Angie, David, Councilmember Kenyon, thank you all for being here today and for the work that you all are doing every day to close some of these disparities. We've had a great conversation. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us for On the Clock.